So, are you interested in exploring the exotic taste of historic cuisine? Then watch on as we delve into a recipe from the 14th and 15th centuries. Medievals ate massive joints of meat straight off of the bone while wiping their faces on sleeves and tablecloth and tossing bones on the floor. Just like Hollywood history classes taught us, right? Yeah, not so much. By contrast to this charming set of imagery, medieval cuisine was immensely varied, complex, and sophisticated, accompanied by a detailed set of rules of table etiquette, including which fingers to use with which types of food, rules for washing hands before, between, and after eating, and in some cases, quasi-religious rituals of service intended to recall the Last Supper and other church ceremonies that were kind of an integral aspect of medieval life. So, dishes across Europe in the Middle Ages and Renaissance consisted of exotic flavor combinations and intense spices from the East, with sweet, sour, and savory all combined into one amazing dish. So let us explore one original medieval recipe and attempt to recreate it using my ill-equipped, modern, yet so dated kitchen. The dish we are exploring today is called Alois de Mutton. It hails from a collection of recipes ascribed to the head cook of King Richard II. A very sad story about how his life ended. Anyway, it's referred to in the oldest manuscript copy as a form of curry. Now note, not that kind of curry. Note, the medieval word curry has nothing to do with Indian curry. The medieval English word, the Middle English word, is a corruption of the Middle French cuire, to cook. In other words, the title really means the manner of cooking. This recipe comes from the Harleian manuscript 4016, which is supposedly housed in the British Library, but I've been unable to find a record of it actually being there or even a digital version of the original manuscript. If you know where to find a digital record of this original, please let me know in the comments below. Speaking of manuscripts, side note, especially for people in organizations that abuse the word scroll, the earlier version of a form of curry is in fact a proper scroll with the leaves sewn together and stored as a roll. Check that out, it's pretty cool. Maybe not so great for looking for recipes, but it's neat. Okay, now back to our source. The original recipe reads, take a fair mutton of the butters and cut it in the manner of steaks, and then take a fair roll of parsley and onions shred small, yolks of Aaron sawn hard, and marry your suet. Hew all these smaller together, and then cast thereto powder of ginger and saffron, and stir him together with thy hand, and lay him up upon the steaks all abroad, and cast thereto salt, and roll him together, and put him on a spit and roast him till they be enough. So, there's your Middle English for the day. Let's head to the very uncharmingly primitive kitchen to which I currently have access and explore and recreate this dish together. Time to explore our ingredients. First, the mutton. We'll be cutting this into steaks. Powdered ginger. Yes, saffron. Onions. Fresh parsley, beef marrow, because I can't get lamb marrow, salt in a beautiful medieval container, black pepper also in a beautiful medieval container, boiled eggs. So, Alois de Mutton calls for onions shred small. Shred is a 15th century English word that doesn't actually mean shred like we understand it. It actually just means to cut small. Interestingly, it is also the 15th century English word for dags, as in the dagging on your houppelons. They actually frequently, they call them shreds in the texts of the period, not dags, at least not that I have found. So there's your little bit of etymology for the day. Okay, well let's cut these onions and shred them small, as it says. Okay, onions are quote-unquote shredded. Take fair mutton of the butters and cut it in the manner of steaks. So let us take, in this case, I don't really have access to butt of lamb or mutton, but I do have leg of lamb, which is pretty close. So let's go ahead and cut this in 2 slices that will make good rouladen meat rolls, as it were. So I'm going to look and see. I've left it partially frozen so that it will be easier to cut in fine pieces. The recipe doesn't actually say anything about hammering it out, and so I'm actually going to remain faithful to that idea, that it does not say anything about beating it or tenderizing it. And actually with lamb or even mutton, that might be less necessary because it is a more forgiving meat than beef is. So, how to cut you. Okay, I think I'm going to do it this way. Nice and thin. Trying to maintain the same thickness all the way through. Now obviously, in the Middle Ages, they could not have frozen their meat even partially to cut it unless it were winter, I suppose. They could have popped it in their larder and possibly things would have frozen, or put it outside and things might have frozen partially, but who knows if anyone ever even considered that as a technique. I have certainly never read any medieval set of cooking instructions that called for partially frozen meat for the sake of easy slicing. So this is a modern technique, most assuredly. And I rotate it around, flip it over rather, to get rid of that lip that starts forming. Okay, a pile of semi-frozen slices of meat to be rolled and spitted. So I was just examining sort of the end piece here, and it's got a lot of fat on it, and I'm actually going to cut off these bigger chunks of fat, these very solid chunks of fat, and I am going to render this up into lamb's tallow, which I can then use as they would call it in medieval sources, grease. I could use it as a cooking fat. I can use it to make pastry. I can use it to make modernly biscuits, what Americans call biscuits anyway. Cooking, frying. Lamb's tallow makes, it's going to sound awful, but lamb's tallow actually makes really tasty donuts and other fried pastries, in case you were wondering. So that is what I'm going to do with all this. I'm going to chop it up really small, render it in boiling water, chill the water after it's all boiled and rendered down, and skim off the fat, and that will be my lamb's tallow. So, bonus on what to do with the leftover bits. After removing all of the extra fat, you can see over here, this is going to become my tallow. I ended up with a couple of nice, actually thick pieces that I am actually going to go ahead and hammer these out into thinner fillets to turn into rouladen. So I thought I would show you how I do that in my currently extremely low-tech kitchen. Most of my kitchen equipment isn't here yet, so I'm actually going to just take an empty glass jar and hammer the crap out of this meat, like so. And then following along the path of the improvement of tools, I cast about my kitchen and realized I have something that might be better actually at hammering this meat out than that glass jar. Yep, definitely better. Recipe also calls for fair raw parsley, so I'm going to go ahead and chop this. Of course, you want to remove all of the woody stems. They are not great texture-wise. fair parsley. So this recipe calls for marrow or suet. I cannot get suet where I'm currently located, but they did have soup bones in the freezer section that actually have some very good marrow bits. So I've let them defrost, and I'm just going to use a spoon to scoop out this marrow. Now these are not typical marrow bones. Usually typical marrow bones are the long bones, the femur. They're easier to kind of crack open and get into, but these soup bones, if they're cut right, can actually give you access to quite a bit of marrow, as you see here. And marrow is very flavorful, and it's very fat rich, so I'm confident that that is the role it plays in this recipe is flavor enhancement. Suet is also basically just another kind of fat, so here we go. Of course, the recipe doesn't give you any kind of idea of ratio or quantity. It never does. So we always have to make guesses, and who knows, our guesses may be completely off, utterly unrelated to anything that, any practice of the Middle Ages or even Renaissance for that matter, when finally they start actually providing real quantities. And if you've never tasted roasted marrow, you have not lived. I can highly recommend it. Here's our nice little collection of marrow. I think this should be sufficient. Yeah, maybe not. If not, I'll just defrost another bone and scoop it out. Okay, onward. Next, hard-boiled eggs. We actually just need the yolk. As is typical in many medieval recipes, it's only the yolk that is called for and not the white. However, I think that probably whoever was preparing this dish just ate the hard-boiled white as they were cooking along. Why not? Sort of the spoils of the person doing the work. Egg yolks. So as I started really looking at the pieces I managed to slice, some of them had some pretty thick areas, and so I decided to pound some of them out as well. And I also, in using my improvised jar, I decided the pan was not as efficient as I'd liked and made way too much noise. So I noticed that there's a ring under at the bottom of this jar, which makes it not really good for flattening things out. But on the side, it's very useful for flattening things out. So I'm going ahead and I'm going to hammer this in the thick parts just to get it to be a little more even and a little more flexible in size. And yes, I was thinking about this. The recipe does not call to tenderize or hammer out the meat. However, a lot of recipes from this era, from the 15th century, assume a good deal of prior knowledge and almost seem to assume that you basically know the techniques and are familiar with the recipe. And so they're not, these recipes are definitely not America's Test Kitchen step-by-step that would allow anyone to create a finished dish. These are aimed at people who know what is done. They know their way around a kitchen. And so I think there's entirely a possibility that a step like this may have been taken for granted. And they certainly had hammers and mallets in this period for other purposes. There's nothing saying they couldn't have had a mallet for flattening meat. And I'm not certain, thinking about it offhand, doesn't come to mind at any rate a recipe that I have found personally that calls for flattening the meat. But I am by no means a dictionary on medieval cookery the way I am a dictionary on medieval dance. So there are way more cooking sources than there are dance sources also, I should emphasize. Far more, infinite, just exponentially more. Hence why I've decided to go ahead and pound the meat out in spots where it's not already thin to make it a little more even, maybe make my fillets a little wider. This was a fairly narrow cut of meat. If I'd actually had access to the cut of the lamb or the beef, if I were doing alos to beef that I wanted, these would be wider for certain. But I am in a situation where I have limited resources for a lot of things right now. I don't have access to a butcher at the moment where I am, so I have to literally take what I can find, and I expect that a good many of you, dear viewers, are in similar circumstances where you do not have the luxury of a butcher who can get you any cut of meat that you like in any quantity from any kind of animal. And so you might also be left with whatever you manage to find in your local store. And so you may, like I, have to improvise in this case. And so I'm going to let this improvisation stand. No? Is this a 100% faithful recreation of the original? Probably not. They probably had an actual cut of meat that would be the butt of the sheep versus the leg, which is the upper part of the leg, not the shank. And that's fine. And hopefully someday I will be able to revisit this recipe with those resources. Until then, here we go. The recipe then says, and then take fair raw, Middle English. And then take a fair raw parsley and onions, shred smaller, yolks of aaron soren hard, and mary or suet. Hew all these smaller together. Okay, so basically it says to take parsley and onions, chopped small, hard-boiled egg yolks, and marrow or suet, and chop this all together small. Now, it occurred to me belatedly just now looking in this bowl at the vast amount of onion that we have here. Medieval onions were most assuredly smaller than modern onions because most modern fruits and vegetables are monstrous modern cultivars of their originals. And so I'm going to actually remove some of this onion, and I'll use it somewhere else. I'll saute it up. Maybe I'll put it in the bottom of the roasting pan with the aloes, the olives, the rolls. But I really am feeling like this is probably proportionately too much onion. That an onion, a 15th century onion, would not be this big. And that's fine. Yes, I'm losing a little bit of the parsley, but that's okay. I think we will get a better result here. Okay, so now I'm actually going to do exactly what the recipe says, and we're going to hew this all small together by chopping it up on the cutting board. Let's go. So as I was chopping and amazed at how these egg yolks do not wish to disintegrate, I had a thought, a thought occurred to me, a little epiphany. I have a family cookie recipe, a butter cookie recipe, probably that dates to the mid-19th century. It's that old, passed down from generation to generation. And it actually calls for boiled egg yolks, and it calls for them to be passed through a sieve to grate, basically pulverize them. And I do know that many medieval recipes call for various things to be passed through a sieve in order to do the same. And so I think going forward, the next time I do this, I will be passing these egg yolks through a sieve. No, the recipe does not call for it in this particular case, but it is a technique from other recipes, and I think it would create better results. Again, this takes us back to my comment of not all techniques are necessarily all described in detail in these recipe collections, and there is a lot of technique and recipe and ingredient knowledge that is absolutely taken for granted. So next time, hard-boiled yolks through sieve. Another thing I should have definitely done was actually mince these onions. The original recipe does say onions shred smaller, and so that really does probably mean minced, and I really did not mince them. I chopped them pretty roughly. That probably would have also made this process now easier. because I really do think this needs to be quite fine indeed, hence why things in some cases are being cut twice, the onions, for instance, because we want to create a sort of smooth paste that we will smear onto our roulades, onto our alois, our steakis, as they are called at the pre-rolled stage in this recipe. Right, well, we have achieved near paste, so this is pretty good. I feel like this is potentially where they mean to take this. If they wanted it finer in this era, I think they probably would have specified ground in a mortar and pestle or some passe with sieve or something like that, but they did not. They said hew it all together. So I've hewed it all together, and now we have a paste that I think will spread quite nicely. Next step, it says, then cast thereto powder of ginger and saffron and stir them together with thy honda. Okay, so I shall put this in a bowl and we shall be adding saffron and powdered ginger. So remember that powdered ginger is a very powerful spice. So you don't want too much. So this should really be a flavor enhancer. I don't think that this should taste of ginger, as it were. Otherwise it might be called alois de mutton of ginger or something like that. So I'm actually going to try a 1/4 teaspoon of ginger in this, and then for the saffron, now if I had my mortar and pestle, I would grind this up, but I don't. So for my saffron, I'm going to go with a pinch of saffron, and I'm just going to lightly mortar and pestle it in my palm of my hand. And I don't want to press too hard, and I don't want to apply too much heat, because that will actually just start getting all of the flavor compounds all over my hand and not into our dish. And I feel like let's go with a little more than that, so that the saffron is actually a present flavor component. It is very clearly not being used to dye this one yellow, because there's none of the usual processes that would allow that to happen, like putting it in an egg yolk or something like that. So I feel this is supposed to be present, and not in terms of its taste, and not just visually present in its color. Okay. Again, this is working, ironically, in a modern kitchen, yet without the tools I actually need for medieval cooking. So medieval cuisine is actually high tech. It's just a different kind of tech than modern tech. Well, it says to mix this with thy honda, and it does also say, no, we add the salt at the next stage. So we're going to stick to that. We're going to do it with mine honda. Certainly feels nice on the fingers. Sort of like a spa day for the fingers, I suppose. Palm of my hand still smells like saffron. What a great smell. Of course, I know some of you out there do not care for saffron at all, and if you want to make this dish for yourself, then obviously leave out the saffron. It's a flavor giver. It doesn't contribute to the texture of the dish, so there'll be nothing tragic in the structural outcome of your alois. Okay. Let me see how this smells. Smells nice. Nothing's overpowering. I'm not overpowered by saffron or by ginger, so that's a good thing, I feel like. A 1/4 teaspoon for this little bit. Just trying to decide. I'm gonna go ahead and give it a taste. I can taste a little bit. I'm going to just add another little dash of ginger. This will probably bring it up to like 3/8 of a teaspoon. I declare this mixture done, whatever that means. And my hands now feel moist and soft like a baby's bottom. Medieval food spa treatments for the win. Well, stay tuned for the next episode when we actually prepare the aloes and experiment with different cooking techniques. Until then, cook creatively.